Hi children, welcome to the next session. Today we are doing with the chapter Changing Earth, second part. So previous class we done with the endogenic forces, and now it's exogenic forces. So we already said the forces that cause movement on the earth are called, on the surface of the earth are called exogenic forces. So here we will study on exogenic forces and work of river, sea, ice and wind. Student, take page number 15. Page number 15, major landforms. So we know the landforms, the landscape is continuously changing due to two factors. One is weathering and another one is erosion. Weathering and erosion. So first line, underline this, the landscape is being continuously worn away by two processes, weathering and erosion. So landscape is continuously worn out by the two processes, they are weathering and erosion. Weathering and erosion. Now weathering means breaking up of the rocks on the surface of the earth. It is known as weathering. Erosion means wearing away of the landscape or topsoil by the agents such as water, wind, ice, etc. Clear? So weathering and erosion causes change in the landscape. Page number 15, first paragraph, major landforms. Weathering is the breaking up of rocks on the earth's surface. Erosion is the wearing away of the landscape by different agents like water, wind and ice. You may get a differentiation question from here. What is weathering? Differentiate between weathering and erosion. These two are the exogenic forces that cause changes in the landscape. Now the process of erosion and deposition create different landforms on the surface of the earth. Now we will study of work of a river. When the river flows, what all changes it causes and what all things are formed, we will study now. So take work of river. When the running water in the river erodes the landscape, you know when water flows, when river flows, it carries mineral, silt, etc. We already studied plains are formed by the action of rivers. So the soil, alluvial soil is formed, that all we studied. So the running water erodes the landscape. When the river tumbles at a steep angle over very hard rocks or down a steep valley, waterfalls are formed. Underline that waterfalls. So work of a river begin with running water erodes the landscape. First one, waterfall. When the river tumbles over a hard rock or steep valley, waterfalls are formed. As the river enters the plain, it twists and turns. You have seen that. When a river flows, it has twists and turns when it flows through the plain. So this causes what? Bends known as meander. Underline meanders. Underline the large. So waterfall you underline, next one is meander. The large, when a river enters the plain, it forms large bends, that is known as meander. Now when this erosion and deposition along the side of the meander, it causes what? The loops come closer and it cut off from the river. And it forms what? Oxbow lakes are formed when the meander loops become very nearby, they cut off from the river and form the oxbow lakes. Oxbow lakes also underline. Now when river overflows, what happens? Floodplains are formed. Underline, as the river floods, it deposits layers of fine soil and other materials called sediments along its banks. So in the river banks, when the river overflows, what happens? Floodplains are formed. Floodplains are formed when the river overflows the banks of the river, fine soil is deposited and floodplains are formed. The raised banks are called levees. The raised river banks are called the levees. This much you have to study from work of a river. And coming to the next page, when the river reaches the sea, you all know that it has to be meet with some large water body. So when it reaches the sea, what happens? Number of streams or distributaries are small branches are formed. Each branch has its own mouth. Okay, this collection of sediments on each mouth are called delta. Underline that point also. Delta also you have to underline here. delta. So when the river reaches approaches the sea, speed of the river decreases, and there will be a number of streams or distributaries, small branches of the river forms, and each branch has its own mouth, and here the sediments, the river, what happens when it slows down, it deposits the sediments that carry, it is known as delta. Next one is work of sea waves. Work of sea waves. So when a sea waves, it causes erosion and deposition of sea waves give rise to the coastal landforms. Coastal landforms are formed when the sea waves eroded and deposit the soil. So the erosion and deposition of the sea waves give rise to coastal landforms. Now when sea waves continuously hit a rock, what happens? The rocks, cracks are formed. Cracks are formed. When these cracks become larger and larger, it causes what? Sea caves are formed. Sea caves are formed. Children, underline that sentence, page number 16. Work of sea waves. The erosion and deposition of sea waves give rise to coastal landforms. Then the sea waves continuously strike at rocks and cracks develop. This become larger and these caves are formed. Sea caves are formed. Close the bracket. Now when the sea caves become larger and larger, what happened? The roof of the caves remain. Only the roof of the sea caves remain, and this makes the sea arches. Underline sea arches. So keep on eroding, what happens? Sea arches are formed, and again with further erosion, the only wall like features like stacks are remained. Stacks are remained. So when you look at this picture, you can see page number 16. This picture, first you can see sea caves. When it become larger, sea arches formed, then stacks, only walls will remain. So these are the work of sea waves. Coming to work of ice, you can see glaciers. Ice means what? Rivers of ice are called glaciers. Glaciers are rivers of ice which to erode the landscape. Underline that sentence. So what happened? The material carried away by the glacier, such as rocks, big and small, sand and silt get deposited. These deposits form glacial moraines. Last sentence of page number 16, you have to underline. The material carried away by the glacier, such as rocks, big and small, sand and silt are deposited. These are known as glacial moraines. Underline that point. Next one is work of wind. Wind, erosion and deposition of wind also changes. It mainly happens in the landscape such as deserts. You can see this kind of erosion and deposition is mainly seen in deserts. So work of wind, page number 17. In deserts, you can see rocks in the shape of mushroom, commonly called mushroom rocks. Winds erode the lower section of the rock more than the upper part. Therefore, such rocks have narrower base and wider top. Underline this much. Then sand dunes we already studied. Yes, from class 4 onwards, you know what are sand dunes. Sand dunes, when winds blow, the hills of sand move from one place to another. So underline that when the wind blows, it lifts and transports sand from one place to another. When it stops blowing, the sand falls and get deposited in low hill-like structures that are known as sand dunes. So work of wind, you have to study two things here, mushroom rocks and sand dunes. When the grains of sand are very fine and light, the wind can carry it over very long distance. When such sand is deposited in large areas, it is called loess. Underline loess also, L-O-E-S-S. So three things you have to study from work of wind: mushroom rocks, sand dunes and loess. Large deposits of loess is found in China. So this is about the chapter Our Changing Earth. So mainly we studied on, first part we studied on two forces. First is endogenic force and second one is exogenic force. Exogenic forces, we know erosion and deposition are the two main factors. That is, erosion means what? Wearing away of landscape, and breaking of rock is known as weathering. Yes. Now, work of a river, you have to study all the important points: meander, oxbow lake, levees, and floodplain. And work of sea waves, you have to study water, sea, cave, arches and stake. Then work of ice, what is glacier? Glacier means rivers of ice. What are glacial moraines? When they deposit, when glaciers carry big and small rocks, sand and silt, it is known as glacial moraines. In the work of wind, you have to study on sand dunes, loess and mushroom rocks. This is about the chapter, children. Hope you all understood. Please do read the chapter very well. Thank you, children. Have a nice day.